Good day and welcome to the Oakland County Megacast on Civic Center TV on 89.3 Lakes FM and lakesfm.com and our other stations today. Joining us from Birmingham, Bingham Farms, Beverly Hills, and the village of Franklin, Birmingham Area Municipal Access Television. Joining us from Bloomfield Hills, 88.1 WBFH, The Biff, my alma mater, out of Bloomfield Hills High School. Station manager Ron Whittables overseeing that great operation. And then also joining us from Avondale Schools in Auburn Hills, WAHS 89.5 Avondale Community Radio. That makes up what is the Megacast family of TV and radio outlets. It's not a podcast. It's not just a radio broadcast. It's not just a TV show. It's not just a Facebook live stream. It's a little bit of everything, all encapsulated into one single show, bringing you the information that you absolutely need to know in your community here in Oakland County about the coronavirus and the absolute onslaught of news associated with this unprecedented crisis of ours. We're also today joined by our Facebook partner. Today, that Facebook partner is the West Bloomfield Township Clerk's office. And a big thank you to West Bloomfield Township Clerk Debbie Binder for allowing us to live stream our show on her Facebook page, on her office's Facebook page today. We have a lot of things making news today, and for all the coronavirus news in Oakland County that you need to know, go to civiccentertv.com. On civiccentertv.com, we have clips, we have full episodes, we have the governor's press conferences. We also have all that content from the Megacast on civiccentertv.com/megacast, or you can go to the homepage and click on Megacast and find all of the content from today's show and all of our shows from throughout the week. But that's just one outlet that we have, one set of resources that we have for you here on civiccentertv.com related to the Megacast. We also have our coronavirus page, civiccentertv.com/coronavirus. On there, all of our top headlines for today, including news about budget issues in the state of Michigan. A big budget crisis going on right now as related to COVID-19 and what municipalities and what the state level has had to do to potentially shoulder the burden of major budget cuts. Detroit area suburbs are facing a budget squeeze in the COVID-19 outbreak, as reported by the Detroit News. A lot of municipalities are planning for massive declines in state funding through revenue sharing as property values go down and less tax revenue comes in to these municipalities. They're also preparing for some residents to have issues paying some of their summer taxes, which will also affect the funding in these municipalities. Millions of dollars in potential losses coming in from, as I said, property taxes, from taxable values being decreased, from programs like recreation programs and road fixtures that may not be going on this summer that could affect extra revenue coming into these municipalities. These are all things that are affecting the state's budget for 2021, which is currently being deliberated at the state level, and cuts are going to be made. They're coming. They're definitely coming. But how severe they are is going to be determined by a number of factors. And yesterday in her press conference, Governor Whitmer did address that. Big cuts are coming if the federal government does not bail out Michigan and other states in the union in order to support them in what they need in order to maintain a balanced budget. Governor Whitmer warned that Michigan will have to dramatically cut spending and services if the federal government does not send block grants. She said, "We can't do it on our own. We need a partner in the federal government." In her press conference on Thursday, Whitmer said that the budget shortfall of $3.2 billion this fiscal year is what's hitting Michigan, and $3 billion potentially for the next fiscal year. Not clear whether or not this could be cut. This cut could be helped by the federal government. How intensely that these cuts could be mitigated by help from the federal government, but it does appear to be a situation that is ongoing, and if aid is not provided to the state of Michigan and other states, we have our local local governments and the state government urging the federal government, particularly the U.S. Senate, to pass a fourth supplemental aid bill in order to provide necessary funding assistance to these communities, to the states, so that local municipalities can be properly funded. Actually, yesterday in her press conference, Governor Gretchen Whitmer had Michigan Budget Director Chris Kolb talk about how critical services are likely to take on significant cuts without the aid of the federal government. Here is that clip from yesterday's press conference from Governor Whitmer in Lansing.
The fact of the matter is, department budgets are already skinny, and there's simply no way to cut our way out of this just by looking at state budgets. 3/4 of discretionary state spending goes out to other entities, as I said, like schools, local governments, healthcare providers. The state's rainy day fund currently stands at just over $1.2 billion. Even if we used every single penny in that fund, we won't be able to solve or close our budget problem. A broader solution is needed, and Congress must come together to provide it. Without more funding and more flexibility in existing federal funds, state and local governments will be unable to provide existing critical support for education, public safety, and health care.
And these are going to be the big issues coming up in the state of Michigan and other states throughout the U.S., because almost every single state is facing a budget crisis as a result of COVID-19. There have been massive financial hits that have been taken due to the loss of sales tax, of property values being decreased during this crisis, and taxable values are down, and there's a budget crisis. One way or another, cuts are going to be made, and the severity of those cuts is going to be determined by what other aid can be provided to these states, at least according to our leaders in the executive branch in Lansing. Other stories making news right now at civiccentertv.com/coronavirus. More controversy out of Owasso. That continues on. The Owasso barber is still open and is appealing to the state Supreme Court. The Michigan Court of Appeals ordered a lower court on Thursday to issue a preliminary injunction against Carl Mahnke, the owner of the barber shop in Owasso that's been making all the headlines lately, saying he needs to immediately cease all operations at his barber shop in Owasso. The 77-year-old Mahnke is not done fighting. However, he said, quote, "We are in the 5th round of a 10-round prize fight," he was quoted saying in an article in the Detroit News. Dana Nessel's office in the statement said that she was pleased with the Court of Appeals' decision. Mahnke's attorney, David Kalman, argued that the Court of Appeals order was entered in violation of the Michigan Supreme Court's rules that require such a reversal of a trial judge to have a unanimous approval. So that's going to continue on. That story definitely not going away. The Owasso barber is not giving up just yet. And meanwhile, other barbers and salons throughout the state put together an 8-step plan and sent that to Governor Whitmer's office earlier on in the week. She did respond to that in a press conference yesterday. We got a lot to get to today. I can't get to that clip right now, but I urge you, civiccentertv.com/megacast. You can see her entire press conference right there. Other news making headlines today. Don't expect to touch the produce at Metro Detroit's farmers markets. As farmers markets begin to open around our area, they face a slew of various challenges as they try to reopen safely and maintain coronavirus prevention guidelines. The Birmingham Farmers Market tried a new practice of having customers drive through the market, where they enter the market on the south driveway and stop at the vendors of their choice. With fewer vendors, customers are not supposed to touch the produce either. Those are just a couple of the precautions being made. And the Farmington Farmers Market reported that it had to shrink its market by 70% to keep up with the state's restrictions and guidelines related to COVID-19. So more changes coming to your local farmers markets. And lastly, before we continue on, the timing is not right, says Birmingham City Manager Joe Valentine, regarding people gathering in Birmingham on Woodward for the Woodward Dream Cruise. The Dream Cruise brings about 1.5 million people from around the world to the local area every single year, and he is urging them not to gather as normally happens, Joe Valentine, the city manager of the city of Birmingham, urging people from in the city and around that may be visiting every year for the Dream Cruise not to gather due to COVID-19 related precautions. The Dream Cruise organizers have canceled their official Dream Cruise related events to encourage social distancing and prevent more coronavirus related issues that could stem from large gatherings at the Dream Cruise. But they say they cannot stop cruisers or curb the local passion for cars in the state of Michigan. You definitely can't do that. And lastly, Oakland County coronavirus cases by zip code. This is a very helpful link. Gives you up-to-date information straight from Oakland County's government in regards to the COVID-19 outbreak in various areas of Oakland County. How severe are the coronavirus numbers in places like Springfield Township and Clarkston, as opposed to places like Southfield and Lathrop Village and here in West Bloomfield where our studios are. You can see all of that on the Oakland County government's website. And you have a link directly to that at civiccentertv.com/coronavirus. That are your headlines today. We have a packed show. We have Chief Jeffrey Baker coming up in a few minutes from the Auburn Hills Police Department. We'll speak to Dan Dickerson, the Detroit Tigers radio network play-by-play announcer, also in the first hour of the show. And to kick off the second hour of the show, we'll have James R. Cool, from the producing artistic director from Tipping Point Theater. We'll talk more sports with Ansar Khan from M Live. We'll talk Red Wings and Pistons and the future of the NHL and NBA season. And at the tail end of the show, we'll check in with West Bloomfield Township Clerk Debbie Binder to talk all about the U.S. Census and the absentee ballot, the current absentee ballot issue in the state of Michigan. Michigan sending absentee ballot applications out to registered voters recently. That created a little bit of controversy. We'll get some updates from Debbie Binder about that. But we talked about budget issues in our headlines, and a lot of those budget issues are going to have a serious effect on our local schools. And to talk about that in more detail, we're now joined by Dr. Jim Schwarz, the Superintendent of Avondale Schools, who are also joining us every single day on this show on WAHS 89.5 Avondale Community Radio. Dr. Schwarz, thank you for being with us today.
Thank you. Great to be with you.
So how are you? How is your team at Avondale Schools?
We're doing well. We're navigating the challenges as well as we can.
School year is about to come to an end in most places. I would assume that's coming up very soon in Avondale Schools as well. Any challenges as we approach the end of the year still in this virtual education standard?
Well, yeah. I mean, we certainly, are continually working on the improvement of the delivery of instruction from a remote perspective. As all of us were thrust into this new paradigm of teaching overnight. I mean, literally overnight. As we've gone, we've been able to make adjustments and modify our plans as we're getting feedback from our constituency in terms of what's working, what are some things to tweak, and so on. So, we continue on refining what that remote learning paradigm, how that operates. We're also looking at summer school and putting the finishing touches on our plans for the offering of what is going to be virtual summer school for students that will be starting up shortly as the school year concludes. And in addition, we're looking at the fall and what fall instruction may look like.
We'll talk more on that in a few minutes. You mentioned some of the challenges you have maybe at the end of this school year that and that you had at the beginning of this whole process during the COVID-19 pandemic with going to virtual very suddenly, getting through all of that, getting into the process, kind of getting the hang of things. And now you're at the end of the year, you've learned a lot of lessons. How's Avondale Schools, your teachers, your students, and the administrative level applying those lessons as you begin to plan for fall 2020?
Well, we're beginning to look at, the fall plans are, we haven't committed to any particular plan as of yet because we know there are a number of task forces that are working on recommendations, from the governor's office to the Michigan Department of Ed to Oakland Schools. All of those entities have task forces that are working to create a system of guidelines for consistency across the state in terms of how the fall looks. We're also looking at national guidelines as they're coming out, CDC guidelines, and we're looking at what other states are doing as well as they are slowly opening up. So we're taking a look at all of those things, and we're also juxtaposing next to that our experiences in this remote format. We do believe that there will be some ratio of seated instruction where kids will be in attendance in a classroom, and a part of their week will also be remote instruction as well. We don't have necessarily that ratio pinned down yet as to what that specifically will look like from a scheduling perspective, but conceptually we know that it's probably going to be some variety of seated versus remote as we start. So with that, we're looking at our current remote formats and looking at streamlining things to make it easier for families, particularly with multiple children, so that they're not straddling several different formats depending on the age of their child, trying to create a greater consistency in that remote setting.
Everyone's kind of figuring this out as they go. It's new for everyone in Michigan, in Oakland County, and even throughout the world. We talked recently with Superintendents Pat Watson in Bloomfield Hills and Kenneth Gutman in Walled Lake, and they had said that they'd been talking to neighboring areas and their superintendents, and even to superintendents internationally in places like in Belgium and in Korea. Have you had any contact with other superintendents locally in Michigan, in other states, maybe in other countries, and how have those ideas that you've exchanged and you've received impacted how you're going about planning for next year and the future?
Sure. As a county, the superintendents in the county, we all talk quite frequently with each other. So, we all have our own hotlines of communication, and we stay in touch pretty regularly, especially in these times of crisis. And we, as a group, are communicating statewide, multi-state, and getting ideas from across, the globe as well. The whole aspect of social distancing and trying to interweave what that may look like at the beginning of the year is probably the biggest challenge for all of us, in terms of how many students can you conceivably have per square footage, in a classroom. Pending whatever the social distancing guidelines or restrictions are going to be at that point in time. So, we're still all looking in a crystal ball because we don't know what rules we're going to be obligated to fall under at that point in time. But we're certainly looking at what's happening in places like Denmark, South Korea, pertaining to, masks and hand washing scenarios, and looking at how many students you can have in a classroom at one time, split shifts, looking at transportation, how many students can you conceivably put on a school bus? We're in all those conversations together.
Dr. Schwarz, thanks again so much for being here with us today. Erica Jones here, and I know you said that the superintendents in the county, you guys all have a hotline, so you're in touch all the time. So there's been a lot of talk lately. It's been pretty big news about how West Bloomfield has, come up with a plan, or at least tentative, as to what they've told their students and families they'll be doing in the fall. So was there talk amongst all the other districts in the counties about potentially following something like that when West Bloomfield made that announcement? Was that a group discussion that you guys all made, or how did that play into other districts' plans?
Yeah, we're looking at that. We are all, I think West Bloomfield was one of the first ones to stick themselves out there with a specific plan. We don't know to what extent those plans will have to change depending on what the task force recommendations are, in terms of what the social distancing restrictions will be at that point in time. So I sense that, we'll all be moving to something probably remotely similar to that. Many of us are waiting to see what the task forces reveal before we commit to a specific plan. But we are all, we're all working and watching and communicating and collaborating on that.
You mentioned different guidelines, such as the social distancing guidelines, PPE protection, such as face masks, and how those are going to be worn by students in the classroom. And you mentioned things like that maybe aren't frontline issues to people that aren't in education, such as how do you fit all the kids on the school bus? Not everyone's going to be able to be dropped off or by a parent or walk to school. A lot of students take the bus, and the Centers for Disease Control recently released guidelines and recommendations for schools for the fall that included separating student belongings and included 25% capacity recommendation for school buses on top of facial coverings. Do you believe that those goals that were and those benchmarks that were set in those guidelines are attainable? And what guidelines are you discussing within Avondale schools relating to that to make it more realistic for your community?
Yeah. I commend the folks that put those recommendations together. Obviously, they put those recommendations together without budget limitations, which we are all under. And I've heard your comments prior to me coming on the air about state budgets and the difficult times that we're going to be in. So we have to balance the recommendations that are coming with what's affordable, because we have to balance, obviously, our budgets. So the state, is what we're hearing is going to be looking at schools with probably the historic cuts, just at a time when schools need more money. With students academically coming in, with students with social emotional needs, with social distancing protocols, all of that costs. And they're going to be removing significant dollars from schools at a time when we need more. And that's really unfortunate. So to your question, we're going to be, we're planning on what can we do conceivably to the best that we can budgetarily to fit the guidelines that we sense will be coming. I don't know that the task forces from the governor's office and so on will be flat out adopting what the CDC recommends, or they'll be using other avenues of recommendations that are coming down the pike from elsewhere. So, again, we're kind of in a wait and see mode at this point on all of the specific particulars, but we do know that budget plays a huge role in being able to adapt to whatever protocols are prescribed.
So there's been a variety of different estimations for what the potential per pupil cuts could be for schools going forward in 2021 and for the rest of this particular school year. The latest consensus revenue estimating conference put that at about $600 per pupil, and we've heard other estimates. The governor even mentioned in her press conference yesterday some of these estimates are going anywhere from $800 to $2,000 per student, and even though she mentioned she doesn't exactly know where those particular estimates are coming from. On top of that, the Michigan Budget Director, Chris Kolb, mentioned there's going to be another estimating conference at least before they go forward making their budget. At this current juncture, if the $600 per student cuts are made, how severe? Give us an insight on that, because I'm not someone that budgets the schools. I don't follow school budgets as closely as a school administrator does in your case. How severe is $600 per student of a cut for a school district like Avondale?
So it's significant. It's significant. We're talking, for us, it's about $2.5 million that is to our budget that we have to seek, somewhere in the system to balance. And that's huge. When you're talking about, a fund balance perspective for us, that is, a $600 cut is probably about close to an 8% drop on our fund balance, which is something that, we simply can't do without cuts in the district. So, we've already begun the process of looking at, how we would balance a budget with that kind of a cut. And it does mean reduction of programs. It does mean reduction of staff. It does mean a reduction of services, again, just at a time when you need more. And it's it's really unfortunate. And,
and
it would be, go ahead.
Yeah, and at a time too where these schools we mentioned, we had talked to Kenneth Gutman a few weeks back, not the last time he was on, but one time before that even, and he had mentioned that Walled Lake schools in particular was just about at the point where they had fully recovered financially and gotten back to par from the losses that they took during the financial crises of 2008.
Yeah.
How is that measuring up in Avondale? Was Avondale schools about back at that point or close to being recovered? And how does this set them back in that process?
We were, much like Walled Lake, we were just rounding the bend on getting back to, I'll say, healing from the market crash, from years ago. Our staff has taken concessions, frankly, for almost the last 8 years. On salary and benefits and all of those, and we were just rounding back the corner, and then this happens. And this is a lot deeper of a cut, almost double of the cut that we took back when the market crashed. So if it's taken us 8 years to get to this point, and now we're going to have double the cut of what we had that took us 8 years, so does this mean now 16 years? I mean, the point is that schools, or the legislature, needs to fund schools differently. And not just differently, they need to prioritize funding schools, which they haven't done. So, it's time for our legislators to step up and make education a priority in this state. The Michigan Department of Ed has had the mantra that they want to be a top 10 school in 10 years. And that was 5 years ago. So now it's top 10 school in 5 years. And the legislature does not have that same mentality. And it's time that they do.
You mentioned previously when you were on the show that, and it's great and it really makes sense in context of what we're currently doing in our schools with the with the distance learning and the potential for hybrid learning of in-person and at-home virtual learning in the future. You mentioned last time that you were on, one of the last times you were on, that technology like laptops is almost as vital as pencils and paper in today's educational landscape. Now, on top of that, there's a technology gap, and we have to identify there's absolutely a technology gap between families all across the state, all across the country. And with this being the status quo, have you and other superintendents been urging the local county government, the Board of Commissioners and Oakland Schools, and even at the state level or the federal level, for more focus in the budget potentially, or funding potentially, to help provide some way to bridge that gap so that students can continue to learn virtually if that becomes more of the norm as we go forward? Sure.
And this crisis just underscores the inequity that we have with devices and the ability to conduct school electronically. We make assumptions that everybody has a computer at home and that everybody has connectivity. And in these times, we have found out rather quickly that that's not the case. I come back to the comments I made in the last interview about computers and this connectivity is as essential as a pencil and a paper nowadays. I mean, we have to provide students with adequate devices statewide. That is something that should be a priority of the state, to erase that equity gap so that all students have the ability equitably to learn. And I foresee that this remote learning paradigm that we're in is here to stay. It's here to stay in some format. And we need to prepare our students and our families and provide for that.
Dr. James Schwarz, Avondale Schools Superintendent, just a couple more minutes before I have to let you go. So on that note, if we are unable to provide adequate technology, internet connectivity, laptops or tablets or some other device that allows these students to connect to their education system if they're participating in distance learning, if that's not going to be able to be provided to students in Avondale and in school districts throughout the state, what is that going to mean for the individual student, especially in those families that may not have the technology they need?
Sure. If we can't provide for that, it's going to further drive the opportunity gap It's further going to create a system of haves and have-nots, quite simply. And so it's imperative that, we are providing equitably the tools for success, whether they're in the classroom or outside the classroom, so that we can, mend what already is an opportunity gap. It's just going to widen the further that we go without adequate tools.
Well, Dr. James Schwarz from Avondale Schools, their superintendent, hopefully we'll be able to get through this crisis smoothly and with the education of the child in mind first and foremost, and hopefully in the coming weeks and coming months we'll speak to you and we'll have some good news. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
James Schwarz, Superintendent of Avondale Schools, who is joining us on every single episode of the Megacast on WAHS 89.5 Avondale Community Radio, on our family of TV and radio stations here on the Megacast. Also, another big thank you to the West Bloomfield Township Clerk's office for joining us today on Facebook Live. They are our Facebook partner today. As we bring you this final Megacast of this week and continue on a big show ahead, lots to talk about, and education is a huge issue. It's one of those hallmark issues within the budget issue. It's an issue within an issue that's being discussed at the state level. Governor Gretchen Whitmer mentioned education several times when talking about the budget in her press conference yesterday, as did Chris Kolb, Michigan's budget director, as did a child care provider, mentioned that as well. It's critical, and these budget issues are not going away anytime soon, so hopefully we'll be able to take care of those smoothly. Budget issues aren't the only issues out in the community. We also have more people flocking out to the streets now that the weather is better. Stores and other businesses are reopening, and that presents different challenges for different communities. And to talk about the challenges in the city of Auburn Hills, we're now joined by Jeffrey Baker, the police chief of the city of Auburn Hills. Chief Baker, thank you for being with us.
You're welcome. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you? How are your officers?
We're doing well. We're hanging in there. This has been, for everybody, for the community, for law enforcement, for businesses. It's been a different type of a situation dealing with a pandemic like this. And I think, considering all things, we're doing well.
That's good to hear. How have you and your officers been able to weather this? What challenges maybe have you faced and tackled during this crisis that you are particularly proud of?
Well, when this all broke in mid-March, I feel pretty proud of our staff. We worked very tirelessly to come up with a plan to be able to keep our officers safe. I mean, certainly when something like this happens, we have to continue to enforce the laws of the community and keep our community safe. So we needed to figure out a way to do that while keeping our officers safe. I mean, certainly we don't want officers sick, and we don't want them taking it home to their families. And equally as important, we want to be able to have officers on the street when our citizens call us and need us, whether it be some sort of an emergency at their house or even something so simple as a traffic crash. We need to be there for them. So we need to make sure that our officers stayed healthy. So we put together a comprehensive plan to do so, which included, obviously a lot of the things that you hear now with the social distancing and the wearing of masks. And if you think about it, I really feel now for the folks that work in the medical community, because we've worn masks throughout the years when we practice, donning our gas masks and things like that, but never to the extent we wear them now. And these men and women out there in the patrol cars, anytime they have contact with the community, have to put one of those masks on. And so when I see the folks in the hospitals wearing these things for 12 hours a day, I feel for them, because I'm sure you wear them yourself. They're not comfortable, especially the thicker N95 masks. So when they're out on the street dealing with folks and trying to help them, they're definitely social distancing and utilizing the hand sanitizers. We've done some things with our staff to make sure that they're safe and try to keep them working and employed. And we've been very fortunate here. Auburn Hills does not have a high number of cases, and we're proud of that. And as far as our officers, I guess I could say, knock on wood, we haven't had anybody that's contracted the COVID.
Well, that's good to hear. And we're also getting into more of the warmer weather months, Governor Whitmer and her team have continued to lift restrictions on various sectors of the economy. Local businesses and retailers now able to reopen to some extent with restrictions such as no more than 10 people in a facility at a time, social distancing, wearing your masks, all of that, and by appointment. So with that all being said, with people more out and about now than they had been previously in this pandemic, what's Auburn Hills been doing to prepare for that from a law enforcement perspective and even from an education perspective in the community?
Well, there's a couple parts to that. I mean, certainly a strong social media, and when it comes to dealing with our community, getting out in front of this and meeting with the businesses, not only the police department, the fire department, our community development department, our city administration has been meeting with several businesses. This is an ongoing thing, working with local restaurants when it comes to the potential to have folks having, say, outdoor seating. We were just notified this week that Great Lakes Crossing is slated to open this week. So we've done a lion's share of the work getting ahead of some of this by meeting with the businesses. They're well aware of what they can and can't do. The problem we run into is when businesses such as what I just talked about and some of the other businesses that have been operating for a while, when they open, there's complaints that come in. And short of having a entity that actually investigates these type of complaints, when people have issues with the way a business is operating, they contact the police department. So ultimately we get caught in the middle of it and we end up responding out. We've responded out to businesses that should not be operating according to the caller. We've responded out to complaints of social distancing violations. We've responded out to complaints of whether it be customers at the store or employees not wearing their masks. So we see a litany of that type of thing. So the most important thing for our officers is to have an understanding of what they can and can't do. And the key word that I impress upon the officers and my command staff is reasonableness and to use common sense. This isn't a situation we need to be out there putting people in handcuffs and hauling them off to jail. I think education and speaking with people, you try to reason with them, and if you've got somebody, let's say, that doesn't want to wear a mask, you try to reason with them and get a common agreement, as opposed to some sort of a where it becomes anything more than a discussion. And that's our goal. We certainly don't want to turn this into anything more than it's not. And we just want people to be safe. And
Chief Jeffrey
that's our main goal.
Chief Jeffrey Baker from the Auburn Hills Police Department joining us on the Megacast. You mentioned some of those isolated incidents with people not wearing masks, businesses that shouldn't be open and operating, being open and operating. But in a general sense, in the city of Auburn Hills, what has been the status of compliance? Are people generally following those guidelines and doing their part in preventing a further spread of the coronavirus?
Oh, I think generally, everybody's doing their fair share. We've got some fantastic citizens here in Auburn Hills, and certainly our business community. They're great partners. Matter of fact, many of them reached out to both law enforcement and fire department personnel, and they have extended themselves. Many of them have bent over backwards getting us personal protection equipment, hand sanitizers, masks. Some companies have literally changed their assembly line into creating some of these pieces of equipment that we need. So the business community and again, our citizens, they've reached out to us asking us what we need. So they've been fantastic to work with. On occasion, we get complaints, as I mentioned. We'll get a complaint of a business that's operating where it shouldn't, or the social distancing or the mask use, but we're not seeing a huge number of those calls. At first we had a couple per day, and that's trickled down to, we seldom run on those type of calls anymore, but we still, once in a while, we'll get a call with somebody, having some sort of concern about maybe somebody that's preparing their food and they're not wearing a mask, and we'll respond over there and check on it and see if there's any validity to their complaint. And if there is, then we'll speak with the manager and see if we can get it resolved.
All right. Well, thank you very much for being with us, Chief Jeffrey Baker from the Auburn Hills Police Department. Before I let you go, anything else you'd like to say to residents of the city of Auburn Hills, to people in surrounding areas as we continue through this crisis?
Well, I think the most important thing during all this is to be safe. And one thing I do want to talk to people about is to be very careful with their driving. We've noticed that I think a lot of people have recognized that the lack of law enforcement and traffic enforcement out there. We haven't seen a lot of police cars pulling people over. And as a result, we've seen the speeds increase tremendously. And I want folks to know, fair warning, that we are enforcing traffic laws. You will see our cars out there enforcing the traffic laws, the speed laws. We've run some traffic enforcement pieces on the expressway, and some of the speeds that we're seeing are, I mean, they're well over 100 miles an hour. Some of them are exceeding 130 miles an hour, and that's too fast. People are going to get hurt, and we want people to be safe. So fair warning, our officers are out there. They are stopping people, and tickets will be issued if they deem that necessary. So be careful. We just want people to be safe.
Everyone should be careful. Great advice, Chief Baker. Chief Jeffrey Baker from the Auburn Hills Police Department. Thank you for being with us today on the Megacast.
Thank you.
Joined here on the Megacast by our family of TV and radio stations: Birmingham Area Municipal Access Television in Birmingham, Bingham Farms, Beverly Hills, and Franklin; Civic Center TV in West Bloomfield, Keego Harbor, Orchard Lake, and Sylvan Lake; 89.3 Lakes FM and lakesfm.com, also in the greater West Bloomfield area. And a special thank you, as always, to the Greater West Bloomfield Cable Communications Commission for keeping the lights on and allowing us to continue to do this broadcast 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, for all of you out in Oakland County. Also on 88.1 WBFH, the Biff, out of the Bloomfield Hills School District, and WAHS 89.5 Avondale Community Radio out of the Avondale School District, and all throughout, also in the Auburn Hills area, in Chief Jeffrey Baker's jurisdiction, keeping their masks on, keeping their social distance, following the guidelines set forth in reopened businesses and other public places to keep the community safe as we continue through this crisis and get to a point where we can get back to some sort of normalcy that will include things like going to the ballpark and watching Detroit Tigers baseball, and if you can't get to the ballpark, at least, traveling from place to place throughout Michigan and listening to Dan Dickerson call games on the Detroit Tigers radio network. He joins us now on the Oakland County Megacast. Mr. Dickerson, thank you for joining us.
You bet, Tyler. How are you?
I'm good. How are you? How's your family?
Everybody's good and safe and healthy, and that's the main thing.
That's always good to hear. Let's just face it, it's baseball season. Whether the players are playing in the ballpark, whether a single pitch has been thrown or a single strike or ball has been called, this is baseball's time of year. What have you been hearing most recently from your inner circles within the major league community about the potential for the season to begin?
Well, I think it certainly goes back and forth, doesn't it? You hear about the proposals that have been offered from the players or the owners to the players, and now the players will counter offer. I think we're going to have baseball this year. I think this is a negotiation that is unlike any other. It's not your typical collective bargaining agreement. It has so many more elements to it, and they've got to work through these things. But I think there is such a strong incentive to start, and especially, man, if you could start July 4th weekend, what a thing that would be. And so I think they're going to get a deal done. It doesn't look, there's a lot of back and forth right now, but I think there's such a strong incentive, both financially, but also just as a sport, to make sure that you don't miss an entire season and all the implications that go with that. And the idea that baseball could also help heal the country and certainly give people something to enjoy, listen to, watch during the summer months is big. And I think baseball will figure it out. And I think we will have baseball. It's not easy. You have to emphasize it. And you know all the discussions. I mean, just listening to Chief Baker there about, all the things that they deal with on a daily basis. It's not going to be easy, but it can be done, and I think it will be. And I'm hoping we'll start sometime in July.
That would be amazing. Like you said, to start on a date like July 4th with the opening day. What kind of celebration that would be? That would be absolutely incredible. It'd be our normal opening day in Detroit is its own special holiday. Imagine a holiday within a holiday. That would be just absolutely fantastic. And you mentioned in your most recent comment, you mentioned how much of a rallying point that baseball can be in our community, and how sports can be a sort of rallying point as we continue to fight this issue and we come out of this issue.
Right.
And I think about the last time that we lost sports for an extended period of time, or any really period of time, at least in my memory. And I think back to the immediate aftermath of the September 11th attacks. And even though that was more of a temporary delay and baseball was only out of commission for maybe a week, when it did come back, we had these little small moments like Mike Piazza's game-leading home run against the Phillies, and like President Bush's first pitch at Yankee Stadium. When we do come back from this, do you see a renewed passion, a renewed meaning of the game from the players' perspective, knowing these guys as they return to the ballpark for regular season games potentially?
Yeah, and it's the frustrating part will be they won't be able to show that passion and the joy in the return of baseball, at least in person. So, hopefully baseball gets creative with ways to, I don't know, you see ideas about having watch parties and having people finding ways of gathering together at the same time online to enjoy it together. That's what sports is all about, bringing people together. So I hope I'm sure they are thinking of creative ways to bring people together, because that's what it's all about. Like you said, it's a collective experience, and that's what makes the return of a sport, in this case baseball, which I think holds a different, I don't know, it seems like it holds a place in the hearts of this nation more than maybe any other sport. And I love all sports, but it really could be special. And but the difference will be, obviously comparing it to then, is that it will not be able to be done in person, and you're going to have to get creative to find ways to bring people together in acceptable ways during a pandemic to make sure they all enjoy it.
Dan Dickerson, so great to have you on the show with us today. Thank you so much for being here. And Erica Jones here. We've been hearing a lot in the news lately about players, and salary cuts that they're facing, and different reactions to that. And I know there's been some controversy on that. I'm curious, what are your thoughts on how some of these major league players are reacting to these potential salary cuts that they're facing for the upcoming season?
I don't want to get into the middle of a dispute between owners and players about salary. I'll just say this. There are some, when you see a Max Scherzer on the 8-man committee helping to advise the union leadership on what players are thinking, just be aware that's one of the good guys in the game and one of the smartest baseball players I've ever had the pleasure of being around and getting to know. He's just a smart guy. And so, again, the players have legitimate concerns. The owners have legitimate concerns. There are millions and billions of dollars at stake here. I think that reasonable people can come to a solution. I've read a lot about it. Again, I'm not going to weigh in on either side, but I do think there are ways that this could get done that would be fair to both sides. It's something we've never dealt with before. There is no template for how to deal with this. But I think there are good people on both sides. But I don't know, when I see that Max Scherzer's on that committee, it just makes you think, okay, let's listen to what he says. If he has reasonable concerns, let's listen to that because that's a really sharp guy. And again, owners have legitimate concerns about cash flow and money. So let's see if there can be a deal worked out. I really think there will be.
The owners have to be able to fund the parks, and the players have to be able to get their due as well, playing a full or a partial season, and make what money that they're going to make as much as they possibly can, comparable to what they'd be making in a regular full season. So there's always going to be that balance there, and it gets chippy initially, like any negotiation. But like you're saying, I see that reason will eventually play its course in here, and we'll find some way to get back to this, because ultimately the owners want people to be watching games, buying merchandise, go into the ballpark if it's safe to do so, and the players, you go back to when they're playing t-ball and when they're playing Little League. They love this game. They want to get back on the field. And do you see that desire ultimately being what maybe brings them to that reason?
Yeah, I like I said, there's so much money at stake that I think they'll figure it out, because it's going to be better, let's face it, to play a season than not play a season. And getting to your point about players wanting to play, it is interesting. I think they are such competitors. It's going to be weird to not play with fans in the stands. Let's get that out of the way first. That's going to be very different. But these guys are competitors, and they don't play just because there are fans in the stands. They play because they're competitors. They want to beat that other team. And I think you will see it will be different, but you will see a good brand of baseball because these guys like to play the game. They miss playing the game. I don't think any of them can picture not playing it for an entire year when they're playing it at the major league level or the minor leagues, and that's a whole nother story. So I think, because I do think fans, I wonder, how's it going to be without fans in the stands? You're still going to see a good brand of baseball. These guys are competitors. Someone said, hey, there'll probably be more trash talking that you'll actually hear and be ready for having to delay a little bit. So I think that part of it is going to be, it's still going to be fun to watch.
Oh, it's going to be fun one way or another. And I do like that perspective that you provided of the potential not having fans in the stands to bring in some more extraneous noise and take out that trash talk. And it will be interesting to get more of I'd like to refer to it as an NFL film special perspective into what we're seeing. You see all that trash talk as they're mic'd up later on, years later, as you're going through these historic games, but you don't really hear that a whole lot in the actual broadcast. That would be really interesting, at least from my perspective as a fan, to experience as well. Baseball is in some ways or another maybe back this summer, but one issue that is presented are various states' requirements and the regulations, particularly in Michigan. Governor Whitmer has said very recently on another local radio station, quote, "There is reason to feel some confidence here, but we also have to temper the reactions and say life is going to be different. We are not going to be filling stadiums this fall." With that being the case, in Michigan and in other states that have professional baseball teams and may not be able to put fans in the stands, you see that a situation where you could be in Arizona playing the Diamondbacks and they have some fans in the stands socially distancing, but in places like Detroit you have an empty stadium? Or do you see more of a situation arising like the NHL is talking about, where they may have some hub cities where baseball is being played, where fans may be allowed in the stands in a certain capacity?
I don't see the hub cities. Everything I'm hearing is that they're going to try to play in home ballparks, which I think is probably the right thing to do. I mean, what's right and what's wrong? Right. That seems like a good plan, put it that way. I think you're not going to have crowds at Comerica Park anytime soon. I do think you might have a patchwork that some ballparks in some states, some cities might allow a certain number of fans in. I've already seen that I believe it was Texas governor, who said that they're going to allow 25% capacity. I'm not sure how they came up with 25%, but again, everybody's trying to figure out how many people can you safely get into a ballpark, socially distancing, physically distancing a certain level apart. I mean, the more you read, the more we're finding out about this virus is it's very much in terms of transmission about events being held indoors with prolonged contact, whether it's a workplace or whether it's a social event. A choir practice where everybody was trying to do the right thing, but because of the enclosed space, many members of that choir, I believe it was in Washington, got ill from that, and that was back in March. So the more we're finding out, outdoor events are better, and if you're apart and there's no prolonged exposure to somebody, right in front of you, then I do think that, we're learning more, that it becomes possible as the season goes on, as we learn more about this and how it's transmitted, that you'll have some fans in the stands. But you're right, it could be a patchwork city to city until, each state decides what it's going to do in terms of allowing gatherings of more than 25 or 50 people.
There's no doubt that things are going to be different, and it is going to be something we've never seen before, and hopefully after this process is eventually coming to a close, we never see again in baseball and in life in general. Things are going to be different. It's going to be kind of odd as we get the ball rolling on this, so to speak, but it's still going to be baseball, and people want baseball. The players do, the fans do, the broadcasters do. We're all looking forward to it in some way or another. Dan Dickerson, the Detroit Tigers radio network play-by-play announcer, joining us on the Megacast. One change that is potentially coming to baseball in this scenario is the potential of the designated hitter being both in the American League and
Mhm.
in the National League. How do you see that changing the dynamics of the baseball season going forward?
I've been advocating it for a long time, so I'd be thrilled if that was the case. Whether it would be temporary, probably would be, because the National League is still very resistant to having a DH. But I think for this year, because you're going to have probably more interleague play, it looks like right now you're going to keep the 6 divisions, but keep the Central in the American League playing themselves, so the other 4 teams in your division, and the other 5 teams in the National League Central, same with the East and the West. And I think because you're going to have more interleague games, higher percentage, that's probably why they're talking about the DH in both leagues. I don't think it changes a whole lot. I mean, to me, when we go to a National League city and I have to watch that pitcher bat, and it's just hopeless and helpless, and a good hitter hits, a good hitting pitcher hits about 180 or 200 with no power. So
Right.
I just, I'm done with watching pitchers bat. And you can say it takes a lot of the strategy out of the game, but you can look at both sides. And I'm not sure that it really does. Jim Leland always made the point, it's much harder to decide when to take your pitcher out in the American League than the National League, because in the National League, if you're behind by a run in the 6th inning or 7th inning, you're going to lift that pitcher. If he's coming up, you're going to lift him for a pinch hitter.
Oh, yeah.
American League, you really have to figure out when are you taking that pitcher out based on performance and who's coming up and where we are in the game. So he says actually in the American League, it could be tougher, more strategy, more decisions to be made by the manager that are tougher than in the National League. So and we're not going to miss the double switch. It just doesn't, it doesn't really apply to too many games. So I don't think it would have a major impact. And to me, it's going to have more interesting at-bats versus that automatic out that's at the bottom of the lineup. I just never really appreciated that. It's just, you can take all the strategy arguments you want, but I'm tired of watching pitchers bat.
Oh, the strategy element of it is definitely interesting. How do you bridge that gap
Sure.
from American League to National League? But much like you, I'm also very much in favor of the National League taking on the designated hitter, because there's no reason to play a baseball game where one team's at home in a regular game playing against a team in the American League that they're also in the league with, and have 9 batters, and then all of a sudden they go out west, or they go into the Central States and they're playing in the National League, and all of a sudden they can only have 8 batters. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So it's time, and maybe this will finally be what draws that change across the league. So Dan Dickerson, just a couple more minutes with you here on the Megacast, the Detroit Tigers radio network play-by-play announcer. You've been around the league for a bit. You've had communications with legends who've been around the game and seen the history of this game develop, like Ernie Harwell. And in a time like this, in this unprecedented moment where baseball has been in some ways lost up to this point, and maybe back in some capacity, and not all is lost, but we've lost a lot so far in terms of the sports season. In terms of the historical perspective, from the stories you've heard from your colleagues in the industry and from what you've experienced in your career calling baseball games and covering sports, does this compare to anything, or is this in the past that you've experienced or that you are aware of, or is this completely in its own different echelon?
Oh yeah, you can't compare it to anything, because when you realize that it took 67 pages for Major League Baseball to try to address just how they're going to keep players safe going through one typical day at the hotel, at the ballpark, at home, you realize this is unlike anything we've ever experienced. There's nothing to compare it to. The longer we're in this time, the more we are learning about how complicated this virus is, the impact that it can have on people long term. We're learning more and more. It's a process. We're learning more and more about how it spreads, and we can use that information hopefully to keep people healthy. But it's so complicated to try to keep these athletes healthy and expect that all of them will abide by these pretty severe restrictions. I think Major League Baseball did it, they worked with experts. They maybe went overboard in the eyes of the players in terms of how restrictive their interactions are going to be, but they did that to show that, hey, we're trying to do this in the right way so that you guys stay healthy. And I think the players are going to push back a little bit, and that's okay. I think from the league's perspective, if the players want to say, hey, we want to be able to have more interactions in the clubhouse in a safe way, how can we do that? And I think there are some indicators and indications in recent weeks that it's the length of time, again, face to face in a closed indoor setting that matters most. Maybe you can relax some of those things that Major League Baseball came up with. But again, when you see 67 pages just to address every possible scenario, and there are still unanswered questions, you realize this is like nothing we have ever seen. There is no normal to go back to, and it's going to be a new normal that everybody has to kind of get their brains around, and that's a process. That's a big deal.
Talking to Dan Dickerson, the Detroit Tigers radio network play-by-play announcer on the Oakland County Megacast. And as you've heard Dan Dickerson say many times in Tiger baseball broadcasts, we're going to take a very brief pause for station identification. We'll stay right here, though, to do that. You are watching us on Civic Center TV and Birmingham Area Municipal Access Television, and listening to us on the radio on 89.3 WBLD Orchard Lake, West Bloomfield, Kego Harbor, Sylvan Lake, 88.1 WBFH, Bloomfield Hills, that's 88.1, The Biff, and 89.5 WAHS, Auburn Hills, WAHS 89.5, Avondale Community Radio.
I think it's safe to say that every player, every team, it's, the ultimate goal while you're, in the league to win a title and get a ring and everything that's associated with that. So how do you think, the players or even the teams that were serious, I mean, it's serious for everyone regardless of where you stand, but, teams that were more likely to, make it far to the playoffs and everything this year, do you think that they're more discouraged, or do you think this will make them work even harder than they would have before in those positions?
And just talk about the impact of the virus on the league going forward and those particular teams.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think to me a shortened season, and let's go with the current plan of 82 games. I know the players would like it to be closer to 100. Whatever it is, a shortened season is going to me, bring a whole lot more teams, especially when you expand the playoff field to 14 out of 30. You're going to have a lot more teams in this thing, and it could get really interesting really fast. I mean, it's, by the time if you start in, let's say, July 4th, by the time you hit August, that always feels like, the beginning of the kind of the sprint toward the end, and certainly September. And in mid-August, you're not even going to be in the halfway point. So it's going to be fascinating to me to see what teams jump into contention, how teams, because there aren't going to be the traditional minor leagues this year. There doesn't appear to be there will be any minor leagues right now. How do teams with prospects that are close to the major leagues keep those guys sharp so that maybe they can make their debut some point during this season and make an impact on a race? 42-40 could probably make the playoffs this year, or 43 or 44 wins, a little above 500. They're bound to be. If 14 out of 30 teams are going to make it, teams just a little over the 500 mark that are going to make the postseason. I wouldn't count anybody out. And a team like the Tigers, who have Mize, Manning, and Skubal, three really top of the rotation prospects, that's their future, assuming good health. These are all legit prospects that the nation, from coast to coast, evaluators say, these are all top 50, if not top 30 prospects in all of baseball. They can have a big impact in a short season. And a team that was expected to lose a whole lot of games this year suddenly could make some noise if those guys debut, and let's say they're working out of the bullpen in short 3-4 inning stints, or they're piggybacking each other in the rotation. However they decide to continue their development, if they don't get at the minor league level, let's say it's at the major league level in a different role. There are many scenarios where a shortened season could turn non-contenders into teams that can certainly make some noise and fight for one of those 14 spots. So whether it's a contender or a non-contender, I think you're talking about a whole new, there'll be great motivation. I think the teams that focus on how can we take advantage of this situation versus, there are so many restrictions on this isn't as much fun as it was when there were fans in the stands. The teams that embrace it, okay, this is the new normal, and we're going to embrace it, and we're going to go out and show that we can win some games and maybe shock some people. those teams might be the ones to keep an eye on, that have good young talent, that have the right mindset. And while the other ones maybe are still complaining or worrying about the conditions they have to play under, some others might just sneak up.
We've seen youth movements work in basketball. It's worked in other sports because these guys can stay healthy a lot longer and have a lot more energy than maybe the older players for later on in the season. With the Tigers having a manager like Ron Gardenhire, who's been notoriously great with young players throughout his career, and veteran presence like Miguel Cabrera in the clubhouse with these players, that potential for continued growth, especially in an expedited season, a potential for a playoff environment experience, could be huge for the Tigers going forward into the near future.
Remember, you added 4 guys on this Tigers team. This is why I was so excited for the season to start before all this happened, just because I really wanted to see what's the impact on a team when you add, it was 4 free agents, 5 total, but 4 that came from teams that won 100 games. Romine and Maben from the Yankees, Scope and Crone from the Twins. That's not the norm. I know these weren't big name free agents, they're all 1-year deals, but you added 4 veterans to a team that really needed that infusion of veteran presence and knowledge, to a team that had a whole lot of inexperience last year and obviously lost a whole lot of games. The talent is still on the rise. You're going to add some talent from the minor leagues. Those guys last year, some of them are going to get better this year. There's something to work with there, but to add that infusion, I really wanted to see, and I'm looking forward to still seeing what the impact of those guys will be, because that can oftentimes, we've seen this before, teams that are learning how to win, that can have a huge impact, and it can speed up the whole rebuilding process and the development of certain young players. And I thought that was going to be a real important and intriguing aspect to this season. I wasn't going to put a win total on this team, because who knows what could happen when something like that happens. I mean, remember the 2003 Tigers jumped from 43 wins to 72 wins. I mean, this team could have easily gone from 47 in a normal season to the mid-70s, given what they had done in the off season. So now in a shortened season, especially if you start adding the Scoobles and Mises and Mannings of the world, and maybe a position player or two, and with those veterans who are going to be a big piece of this, I really just almost anything could happen. Remember, the Tigers, 73 games in, the year they lost 98 a few years ago, they lost 98 in back-to-back years, but one of those years they were 36 and 37. So 73 games in, they were 1 game under the 500 mark, and then the rest of the season happened. But that gives you a feel for what might happen in a shortened season. It can be a very different look than what would happen over 162.
A youth movement, high-level prospects, veteran experience coming in, and a high-caliber manager. Things are definitely looking up for our Detroit Tigers. Dan Dickerson, Tigers Radio Network play-by-play announcer. Anything else you'd like to say before we let you go? No,
I just you're going to hear a lot about the back and forth between the players and the owners. I just think I go back and forth every day on when we're going to get this started, if we'll get it started. I feel strongly we will get it started. They'll figure it out, and I do think, I don't know, it seems like July 4th is such a perfect restart. You have to get some things done pretty quickly if we're going to get to a July 4th start, because there will have to be at least 2 or 3 weeks of spring training to get players ready. But I think we're going to be playing baseball in July, and I can't wait to start bringing baseball games to fans. Even if they can't be there, I can't wait to bring games to fans real soon.
Neither can we. We thank you so much for giving us your time this morning to speak with us. Dan Dickerson, Detroit Tigers Radio Network play-by-play announcer. Thank you for being with us.
You're welcome. All the best to you guys.
Yeah, same to you, Dan. Dan Dickerson joining us on the Oakland County Megacast. Always love having him on the show with us. Talk Tiger baseball and talk the upcoming MLB season. And man, time flies when you're talking baseball in the summer with Dan Dickerson. I mean, I kind of lost track of time there a little bit during that interview. It's just so much fun talking baseball with Dan and reminiscing about past seasons and the past lore of this pastime of ours here in the United States of America, and hoping for a bright future coming up. So again, we thank Dan Dickerson so much for talking to us about the Detroit Tigers and the baseball season. A lot of controversy right now, a lot of arguing going on, but we see that in all kinds of sports. We've seen that before in the NHL. We've seen that in the NBA. We've seen that in the NFL during collective bargaining agreement negotiations, as Dan mentioned early on. This is not the same kind of an argument here, not the same kind of a negotiation. It's something completely different. The players want their due and the owners want their due as well, but ultimately, baseball is what people want to see, including the players, including the fans, and including the ownership and the administrative level of Major League Baseball. And people also want to get back to the theater. They want to see shows. They want to be entertained. They want to be entertained in person and get away from the TV and see people performing on the stage. And now we are joined by James Arcool from the Tipping Point Theater on the Oakland County Megacast. James, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
How are you? How's your team at Tipping Point?
We're doing okay. It's tough. We're sticking with things. Vast majority of things, like everybody else, are being done remotely, but we're doing everything that we can to keep the business floating.
The performing arts has been hit particularly hard, I would imagine, with theaters closed, shows postponed and canceled, and so on. How have local artists, particularly local thespians, kept the art moving forward and maintained entertainment for their local audiences during this crisis?
Well, that's a big question and a tough one. I think that you're absolutely right that there's a vast majority of our nonprofit theaters are definitely trying to hunker down to survive this. We're an organization that already depends on the donations to cover a vast majority of our costs, being nonprofit, and so we stretch a dollar as far as it can absolutely go. And so when we can't do shows, when we can't rehearse, when we can't perform, it's a really kind of scary time for the industry. But the thing that we're seeing now is we're seeing a lot of theaters adapting and to keep connection to their audience, because through online means and creating online content. But a lot of that, it's not theater. Theater depends on people, a group of people being in the same place at the same time, and our heartbeats getting in sync and our breath getting in sync, and sharing and exploring what it is to be human. And when you can't be in that same room, now it becomes something a little bit different. And so a lot of it has to do with maintaining connection to each other and maintaining connection to our audiences. And so there's a lot of different avenues that have started to accomplish those things. You see a lot of talks with artists and other local businesses. You're seeing some play readings going online, but all of these things are about keeping connection to our audience.
I have a bit of a theater background myself, and I grew up with a lot of people that were much more passionate about theater and about acting than necessarily I was. And one thing that I was always around growing up, particularly in high school, was forensics. And that's another kind of one person performing art, where there's a lot of there's monologue involved, there's some story involved, where one person's playing multiple characters. Have we seen more of that maybe in the virtual realm from the actors you're in contact with and other local entertainment artists in the area through this crisis?
I did. I know forensics. I did it in high school as well. It is one of those, starting points for a lot of individuals in high school. And some of the things that we're seeing now in theaters across the country in this attempt to reopen, as we adjust and are looking for those one-person shows so that we don't have to worry about the interaction between people. Because there's a good friend of mine, another local artist, Guy Sandville at the Purple Rose. He says that theater is a contact sport. We have to be in contact with each other for, exploring these things. And so the one-person show, I think you're going to see a lot more of them moving into the future. But a lot of it depends on the restrictions and what it is that we're going to do to keep the artists safe and keep the audience safe as well.
Talking to James R. Cole from the producing artistic director at Tipping Point Theater on the Oakland County Megacast pre-COVID. Shows were getting prepared, rehearsals were going on, they were scheduled. People may have been already bought their tickets at that point. We had people on our team that were ready to get going on some of their shows and had them postponed and canceled as well. Any plans for reconvening those shows, maybe starting another rehearsal process and bringing those back to the theater? Or are those shows gone and you're moving on after this crisis ultimately passes, whenever that may be?
I think that a lot of theaters right now are just pausing. Like there's a lot of pausing where the productions were, the ones that haven't been produced yet. And I think a lot of places are looking at how it is that they can unpause and continue once it is that the restrictions are lifted. From the people that I've been talking with, there is a lot of talk of taking those shows that were basically canceled and putting them into upcoming seasons and rescheduling them into the future. Certainly not all of them are going to make it to the end or into upcoming seasons, but I think that you're going to see a lot of the shows that were paused that can be produced safely are going to come back in upcoming seasons.
You mentioned earlier keeping the theaters safe for the actors and for those who and for the patrons coming in watching the shows. Any plans in place now to make the transition back to reopening the theater when that may happen that are in place to keep social distance and to keep safety standards at as best level as is humanly possible at Tipping Point Theater?
Well, specifically at Tipping Point, there really are three facets to this, and there are plans that are needed for all of them. First and foremost, we have the artists as a group that we're looking into. We also have our staff that we have to keep safety safety protocols in, and then we also have to develop safety protocols for our audience members. And so the things that we're seeing right now is that Tipping Point Theater is a professional theater company, so that means we contract with the Actors Equity Association, which is the union of professional actors. And so the Actors Equity has just very recently, within the last couple of days, released their 4 criteria for being able to allow their membership to safely come back to work. And those 4 criteria all need to be addressed, and they include making sure that the virus itself in your area is under control. It involves the theater space itself and guidelines for being able to safely rehearse. And a lot of those are going to be very difficult things that we as producers need to make sure that we keep in mind and make a very solid plan so that artists can feel safe coming back to work. So there's one part of it that we do have moving. There's another aspect of it for our audience. There are now articles out there about what theater looks like from an audience standpoint for social distancing. And that's going to involve a lot of reworking of what our current seating arrangements are. Because right now we literally sit directly next to people, and people right behind you, and people right in front of you. And so what you're going to see, and what you're going to see here at Tipping Point, is we hope to reconfigure our seating banks to make sure that we stay socially distant for the time period that we need to stay socially distant. So we have a lot of plans in place there. We're going to be looking at an increase in the sanitation, in disinfecting before and after performances, and what it looks like to even pick up your tickets, the flow of audience to get their tickets to their seats, use restrooms and things of that nature. All of it needs to be given consideration. And then the third part is the staff. How is it that the staff can serve both of these groups? Because we take care of the artists and make sure that all of the artists have what it is that they need, and we take care of the audience members as well. And this mixing of these three different groups is going to be a challenge. And this is why you're going to see a lot of delays in when it is that we can come back. And there's a variety of different scenarios that theaters all over the country are making. Broadway, I think their most optimistic was after Labor Day was the announcement. I'm not positive if that has moved, but we also have the Guthrie in Chicago that has said nothing until March of 2021. And you see everything in between. A lot of theaters saying nothing for 2020, and all of it depends on making sure that all three of these circles are going to be safe, because we can't do what it is that we do until we're sure that all three are being treated equally, and the needs of those to keep them safe are all taken care of.
James R. Cool, thanks so much that was such great insight, and it's so great having you on the show, talking with you. So we were also wondering, the actors themselves, they're just, I have a theater background myself as well, and there are just so many moments on stage that are so crucial, when you're in a storyline, when you're creating moments and building up to those, moments of, climax in a show, the characters need to be close to each other. I mean, there's physical moments that need to happen in order for the audience to feel a certain, certain emotions taking place. So how will that be, implemented once we are able to have, theater again? Will those face-to-face moments still be taking place, or is there a plan to have the actors themselves socially distance?
Right now, in my personal opinion, there aren't too many shows that exist where actors can be socially distant from each other. You're absolutely right that the intimacy and the vulnerability and the exploration of humanity, it pretty much is a prerequisite that we have to be in contact with each other. And that's why the guidelines and the guideposts that the Actors Equity Association has put out are very good at making sure that we address those types of things. And that's why they're saying that the virus needs to be in control before it is that actors can come back to work, because there's a necessity in order to have that particular contact. So with some of the things that are happening is there are some playwrights out there that are adjusting their plays to be able to be done more easily virtually. And that is absolutely wonderful to keep theater going, but that is something that is going to be looking more in the area of film or television. But those types of adaptations are happening. And there are definitely plays that are out there that don't require interactions. And I think that you could do them and keep the actors socially distanced. Not many, but they are out there. And I think that you're going to see a spike in the number of productions of those particular shows. So I guess the short answer is there's not a way to do it without actors being in contact with each other, which is why we have to make sure that that the virus is under control, that we have testing and tracking systems in place, and that we continue with disinfecting things to the best of our ability, because everybody needs to be comfortable. It's not just about the audience, it's about the staff and the artists equally.
James R. Cole joining us from the Tipping Point Theater. He is their producing artistic director. Just a couple more minutes with you, James, before we have to let you go. You've begun a series called Share Your Brilliant Things on YouTube. Tell us a little bit about that series.
Well, the theater Tipping Point did the play Every Brilliant Thing, which is a one-person show. It was written by Duncan Macmillan. And what that show is, Every Brilliant Thing, is it tells the story of a list that a little boy, when he is 7 years old, starts in order to help his mom. And his mom suffers from a mental illness, depression. She has attempted to take her own life when he is 7 years old, is the first time that she attempts it. And this is the way that this 7-year-old processes things, that he wants to be able to give his mom a list of brilliant things reasons to keep going, things worth living for. And what ends up happening throughout the play is that the list continues to come back to him as he gets older. And every time that the list comes back to him, it's at very important times. And at the end of the play, we find out that by creating the list for himself, it changes how he views the world and the therapeutic and benefits to the narrator of the story. And so after we did this original production that really addresses the taboos of talking about depression and mental illness, but it's also very highly based in suicide prevention. After we did that initial 6-week run, we started touring it around to our local communities. We started partnering with organizations to bring it to libraries, to schools, to town hall meetings. And what ended up happening when everything got shut down, it wasn't just the programming here at the theater that got shut down. All of those outreach programs that involved groups of people getting together. So all of those productions of Every Brilliant Thing got postponed and canceled as well. And so the thing that we started is an initiative to make our own list of brilliant things in order to share with the world. Because right now we are seeing an increase in the feeling of isolation. We're seeing an increase in the need for help and support in the area of mental illness. And for us here at Tipping Point, we want to spread that message that you are not alone, that things will get better. And we want to do that through the structure of Every Brilliant Thing. It's to show that people have things worth living for. There are brilliant things still in the world. And we want everybody to go to our social media and sites and our website to see how it is that you can submit your brilliant thing to add to the list. We'll add it to the montage and post them periodically as we get enough of them. And this is all happening in conjunction with trying to negotiate the rights to release our production of Every Brilliant Thing virtually. So while we're trying to get that thing to happen, we thought, you know what, there is a need for everybody to remind us that you are not in this alone, that there are things worth living for, and that things will get better. So we want to encourage everybody to participate in this brilliant thing. It takes 10 seconds to record yourself doing your brilliant thing and telling us what it is and to submit it for us.
Well, that's an absolutely incredible effort, and it's something that people need right now. Entertainment has always been a form of escapism for people, and whether your preferred entertainment is the theater or is television or is film or is music, in some ways that is an escape, and in some ways that's your way of expressing yourself when maybe communicating with another person isn't the way that is best for you to do that. And Every Brilliant Thing, and share your brilliant things on YouTube. It's a fantastic way to spread some of the positive messages and shows of support when we can't be together. And it's an absolutely fantastic effort that you and Tipping Point Theater are doing. So you mentioned that people can go to your social media and your website to get involved. Go ahead and feel free to give us those links, that information, and so we can spread that to our audience.
Great. So we're on Facebook, Tipping Point Theater. We have our own. We go to our website, tippingpointtheater.com. We are on Instagram. We're on Twitter. All of these places you can go, and the guidelines are there. It's very simple to record and submit. Look for all of those details. Just Google us, Tipping Point Theater, and you're going to find easily how it is that you can get there to submit your brilliant thing. And then share the post asking for brilliant things, because we want this to be universal. The more that you can see that these types of things, this humanity experience is young, old, black, white, gay, straight, all of them. We are all in this together, and there is a shared human experience. And so we want to show that diversity in the list of brilliant things as well.
at its core, the sharing of human experiences and emotions is what acting is. It's what performing arts is, and it's so great and so nice to know that in our community, in our area, that something like this has been born and is going on and is helping people hopefully through this really tough time. James Arcool, producing artistic director at Tipping Point Theater. Thank you for being with us today on the Oakland County Megacast.
It was my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Always a pleasure to have people from throughout our community doing amazing things, doing brilliant things, even in our community, especially in a time of crisis like this, where we're all learning something. We're all learning how to get through this together, and we're learning about ourselves, and we're all working through our own issues, just in a general sense, every day in life, and especially during this crisis. Any way that you can help other people is absolutely profound and is absolutely necessary, and it's our duty, each and every one of us, to do whatever we can in that case. And so for James, for his team at Tipping Point Theater, for the other actors and entertainers and just people in general, in the general public who are participating in this, that's an incredible story. And it's a heartwarming story about how the people in the community can take simple gestures to help other people. When I was in the Boy Scouts growing up, and there was something we were told. One of our mottos in our troop was, do a good turn daily. And that's a really great example of people doing a good turn daily, helping other people through entertainment. One other way that entertainment helps bring people joy is in the form of sports. We talked earlier with Dan Dickerson from the Detroit Tigers radio network, and we talked about baseball. We're going to talk some Detroit Pistons and Detroit Red Wings now with an M Live Media Group beat writer Ansar Khan on the Oakland County Megacast. Mr. Khan, thank you for being with us today.
Glad to be with you.
So how are you? How is your team at M Live, your family?
Good. Thanks. Hanging in there. Seems to be hopefully getting better, and hopefully we'll all be over this soon.
Yeah, hopefully. Have you been in the office, or have you been working through this entirely at home?
No, we're all working remotely, working at home. So, even under ordinary circumstances, we're being the jobs that we do, our offices are kind of pretty much the teams, stadiums and arenas that we cover. So we're rarely in the office anyway.
Have you noticed during this that, have you noticed or have you experienced any issue kind of digging in and finding those new stories without the sports games going on to create that narrative as this crisis has continued on, or have you been focusing a little less maybe on the games themselves and on these individual sports and more on the players? How have stories been coming in the sports world during this without a lot of these games going on altogether?
Yeah, no, it's much different, much more difficult when you don't have events to analyze, to write about, to comment. No games since March 10th. So basically, what it's come down to is a lot of analysis, look ahead to what's next, projecting moves that they might make, analyzing potential free agents, draft picks, that sort of thing, kind of a look ahead, and also a bit of a review of the season. So definitely it's been different. Content, trying to come up with new content.
Yeah, projecting the future is definitely the big ticket item of the sports talk world at this current juncture, with sports being out and speculating when are our sports going to come back? When's the NBA going to be back? We talked with Dan Dickerson. When's baseball maybe going to come back, and how is that going to look? But also looking into the future, because some of these seasons may end. Some of our local teams, especially, their seasons may end. They may not qualify for these playoffs, or they might. We'll have to see. Some of these plans for these sports organizations have not been set in stone yet. And you talk about looking into the future. The Pistons this week began their search for a general manager. There's been a lot of names speculated out there so far. One of those names is, of course, Pistons legend Chauncey Billups. Have you heard of any names, any other rumblings of people that the Pistons maybe are looking at so far? Anything serious in their search thus far?
Well, I don't know about serious in their search, but certainly you hear several names names that you would expect. Certainly Chauncey Billups at the top of that list. A couple of years ago, after they fired Stan Van Gundy and were in search of a GM before they hired Ed Stefanski without the title, a lot of speculation that Chauncey was in the running, that he could be the guy. And once again now here, Chauncey 2 years later is probably at the top of the list, certainly among Pistons fans, of who they'd like to see in that job. Another former Piston, Tayshaun Prince, is a possibility. He works for the Memphis Grizzlies. Shane Battier, a local guy from Detroit Country Day, who works for in the analytics department for the Miami Heat. He's certainly a possibility. He also was a candidate 2 years ago. I'm not sure if he interviewed or not, but he withdrew his name from consideration at one point and stayed with the Heat. Those are certainly three names near the top or at the top of the list for the job, which is essentially to work with or under Ed Stefanski and kind of learn the ropes while Stefanski's still here, because especially in Billups' case, he doesn't have any front office experience. He's an analyst for ESPN, so that would seem to be the ideal situation for him to come in and learn all about running a basketball team under Ed Stefanski.
And we've seen that system work before. We struck gold with it in the most recent situation where that happened in Detroit sports way back when Joe Dumars had retired from basketball, and he joined the front office and kind of learned under the wing of guys like Rick Sund how to do the job. Came in and of course built the Going to Work Pistons team that was very successful for a long period of time. So a guy like Chauncey Billups coming in and learning the ropes from someone like Ed Stefanski could in theory work. It's worked before, and maybe they strike gold again. But my question at this moment for you, Ansar Khan from M Live Media Group, is it's been 2 years. Ed Stefanski comes in after Stan Van Gundy is fired and after Jeff Bauer is let go as the general manager. Why now? Why wait 2 years down the road? Why at this point is it finally the time where Tom Gores and Ed Stefanski and Arn Tellem are saying, okay, now it's time to bring someone in to run the basketball operations?
It's a good question. We really don't know what the logic or the reason for the timing, other than possibly, Ed Stefanski's 66. He's been in it for a long time. Perhaps he's looking as a transition toward retirement. That's a possibility. I think maybe when he came in 2 years ago, maybe that was the plan, that just to have him on for a few years, start the rebuild, and then kind of hand over the reins to a younger up-and-coming executive. And basically all we can do is speculate. My guess is that would be the reason. I think probably right from the start when he was hired by Tom Gores that was the plan, and that Stefanski would be kind of a stopgap, a transition into the next era.
And with that being the case, we saw after the Pistons were swept by the Bucks in the playoffs that the front office, particularly in the ownership, the owner Tom Gores had said that this isn't a rebuilding effort. We want to contend right now. They have a season that isn't very successful following that up, and now they're looking for a GM to bring in and learn under Ed Stefanski, or potentially take the basketball operations role away from Ed Stefanski. Do you see that as being a point of transition to acceptance that this Pistons team needs to go through a rebuild, or are they still trying to contend right now with the core, with Blake Griffin, Derrick Rose, Luke Kennard, and the young guys like Christian Wood and Sekou Doumbouya?
No, they're definitely they're absolutely 100% in a rebuild. Last season, 1 year ago at this time, they weren't. The plan was to try to get in the playoffs their goal was to get into the top 4 in the Eastern Conference. They made a series of moves that they felt would bolster their depth and have them in contention, if not for at least for a playoff spot, at least in the upper half or in the middle of the pack of the playoff teams in the Eastern Conference. And then Blake Griffin gets injured, Reggie Jackson gets injured, and it became clear that they're not going anywhere. And so, mid-season they had to reverse course, go into rebuild. They got rid of Andre Drummond. They bought out Reggie Jackson. They bought out Markieff Morris. And so, without a doubt, they're in 100% in rebuild mode now. And I'm sure many would argue that they should have done this earlier, like a year or two earlier. But, when Gorse made the big splash of getting Blake Griffin, they were pretty much all in. I mean, you don't get a guy like Blake Griffin and then go into a rebuild. You have to try to win now. But when it became obvious that they just weren't going to be able to get there with the team that they had, they started blowing it up. And now they are in a rebuild, and it's going to take some time.
And with that being the case, guys like Derrick Rose, who's had a really nice season for the Pistons, has for the most part been able to stay healthy and be very productive running the backcourt, particularly in the second unit for this team. With the rebuild being in full swing and the season maybe being in flux, the Pistons may continue on in play, but likely in the scenarios that we have so far, discussing a potential playoff, the Pistons may not be involved in that. And with the rebuild now in full swing, Derrick Rose has a year left on his contract. He's coming off, he's had a really nice year here in Detroit. Contending teams are looking for a point guard that can lead them to the next level. But the Pistons are also looking for someone to bolster their backcourt going forward, and they may bring in young guys from the draft that would be running their backcourt and could learn a lot from a guy like Derrick Rose. Do you see the Pistons making an effort to move him, and do you think that they have a good chance of being able to do that and getting a decent return?
Yeah, they can definitely move him, and they could have moved him this past season at the trade deadline. But Rose, he likes it here. He wanted to stay. And my guess is that they honored that they could have traded him and would have ordinarily, but they honored his wish to want to remain with the team. He's close to Aaron Tellem, his former agent, and my guess is basically that they honored his wishes to stay with the team. But I can see a scenario where they might use their first round pick on a point guard. That's certainly their biggest need, and where they could draft somebody, bring him in, have him kind of learn under Rose for the first half of the season, and then certainly at the trade deadline, there's really no reason for them to hang on to Rose. They could trade him for a draft pick, and he could help a playoff contending team. So I would be surprised if they didn't trade him by the deadline this year or next season.
Keeping in mind, we mentioned the rebuild being in place, and we mentioned that a lot of that's going to be impacted by the season going forward, whether or not they're going to continue on to play and potentially be contending for any sort of a victory in a playoff scenario. The NBA season has not quite been set for how it's going to continue. We've heard some rumblings of different potential playoff formats, a 1 through 16 seed format. I've also read about potential for a round robin World Cup like format playoff if the season is to continue. Which do you think is more likely given where we stand with COVID-19 and with the way that the NBA works? Keeping in mind that COVID-19 is still very much a factor in all of this.
excuse me for a minute. It's raining real hard here. I got to close the window.
Oh, that's okay. We'll just take a brief pause then. We've been speaking with Ansar Khan, the Detroit Pistons and Red Wings beat writer for MLive Media Group on the Oakland County Megacast on our family of TV and radio stations, Civic Center TV, and Birmingham Area Municipal Access Television on the radio, 89.3 Lakes FM and lakesfm.com, 88.1 WBFH, The Biff, and WAHS 89.5 Avondale Community Radio, talking about the Pistons, their rebuild, and the NBA season, which is not officially scheduled to resume just yet. There are rumblings of different potential scenarios that are out there, and so Ansar Khan from MLive Media Group, some of those formats that have been discussed are a 1 through 16 playoff kind of format, where the one seed, the team with the best record in the league would play the team with the 16th best record in the league, and so on and so forth. Another one that's come up is a World Cup style round robin kind of format with a group stage and then a playoff stage on top of that. Which do you think is more likely, given where we stand with COVID-19 and given where the NBA is kind of leaning with how to continue their season?
You know, I think if all teams are in one hub, Orlando, all 16 playoff teams, I could see them going to a 1 versus 16 where, conferences don't matter. East can play West, obviously. There's no travel, so that doesn't matter. I could see that happening. If they're in two hubs, like, say, Orlando and Vegas, then you would have you'd obviously have to break it up into East and West and do it a 1 through 8 that way. But either way, I think we'll see my guess is it'll be a traditional playoff series, best of 5 first round, or if they do best of 7, if they decide that they have enough time to get 4 rounds or however many rounds of 7-game series in, that they'll do it that way, as opposed to a round robin format.
One issue that's currently contributing to keeping the NBA from restarting its season is the need for a second kind of training camp, even if it's a brief one, just to get guys back up to speed and back into the physicality of the game. And an issue that is within that issue is practice facilities. Some states are allowing sports facilities to reopen and these teams to return to their facilities. Michigan's not one of those. Certain teams have been able to return to their practice facilities and begin to work out and begin to work on basketball once again. The Pistons, not one of those teams that's, of course, able to do that. Will teams be able to begin to move players and operations, do you think, to places that do permit these activities in the near future, especially if a season continuity format is put in place relatively soon?
Are you talking about Pistons specifically?
Pistons specifically, but other teams too that are in areas that maybe aren't allowing gyms to reopen and sports facilities to reopen, because these players need to retrain.
Right, and the other thing that they have to be conscious of is that everybody's on equal footing. You obviously can't have, half the teams are able to start training while the other half are in, states or cities that haven't opened up yet, so to speak. There has to be some equity there, and with also, they have to obviously watch the calendar, and they can't delay this too much longer if they want to get a complete 2021 season in. So yeah, I could see that allowing players in states that are still in a lockdown to travel elsewhere, those teams and have their training camps essentially in those locations for sure. They obviously have to. If they're running up against time, and if Michigan, for instance, or probably not Michigan, since the Pistons aren't. If they go right to the playoffs, obviously the Pistons wouldn't be in it. But whatever team, they have to get them to areas where they can have a training camp and get this thing started.
So we've been talking a lot about the NBA and what potential for a continuity of their season maybe may be coming soon, but there's nothing in place. The NHL, on the other hand, does have a plan. They're coming back with a different playoff format, 24 teams. The NHL Players Association has approved that plan. How can you explain a little from your knowledge? How's that going to work? Will all cities be involved, or are there other locations or a few locations specifically that are in place for this return?
No, well, 24 teams, 7 teams are out of it. Obviously, the Red Wings being last overall in the NHL are done for the season officially. The 24 teams, the plan is to have 2 hub cities that haven't been determined yet. Most likely one in the East, one in the West, and have 12 teams, 12 Eastern Conference playoff teams in one, the 12 Western teams in one. And what they're going to do is the top 4 teams in each conference, by virtue of points percentage, get buys in the first round, and the next 8 teams playing in a play-in tournament, a play-in round, best of 5. And so it'll be 5 versus 12, 6 versus 11, and so on. But while those teams are playing in the best of 5 series, those other 4 teams that get buys into the next round will play a round robin tournament. So 3 games, those 4 teams will play 3 games each against each other. And that'll determine their seedings 1 through 4, and it allows them to stay sharp so that they're not rusty while those other teams are playing.
One issue that is both in the NHL and the NBA that may be oncoming is how do you conduct the draft lottery, giving a continuation of a season where some teams are going to be out and some teams are going to continue on, and in a format where more teams are in the playoffs in the NHL scenario, and an equal number of teams are in the playoffs in the NBA scenario, but performances are different. More basketball was played, more hockey was played. How do you imagine that these draft lotteries may be altered, or will they not be altered at all?
Well, the NHL's already, earlier this week, they announced their plan, and the draft lottery is altered. And it's a bit complicated. What it boils down to is the Red Wings, with the worst record in the league, still nothing changes for them. They still have an 18.5% chance of winning the lottery, which will take place the first phase of the lottery. First of potentially 2 phases will take place on June 26th. And what they're going to do is, same as always, the 15 teams are in the lottery. The 7 that are currently done for the season, plus 8 more that will, the 8 losers of the play-in round of the playoffs, which obviously won't be determined by then. They won't know which teams are going to advance, so they'll use placeholders. They'll designate teams A through H. And what they're going to do on June 26th is, as usual, they'll hold 3 draws to determine the top 3 picks. Now, if those top 3 picks, the 3 teams that win those draws are among the 7 whose seasons are over, then that's it. Then there's no need to have a second phase of the lottery. But if a team that qualified for the playoffs wins one of those draws, then they'll have to have a second phase of the lottery at a point that still hasn't been determined. It'll be obviously after the play-in round. But as far as from the Red Wings' point of view, nothing changes for them. Still 18.5% chance of winning, but also a 50.6% chance of dropping to 4th, which is the lowest that they can go. Ottawa, the second worst team in the league, by virtue of having San Jose's first round pick. San Jose was the 3rd worst team in the league. Ottawa actually has the best chance of winning the lottery at 25%. And as far as the NBA, I don't believe they've
haven't
announced anything.
Yeah, they haven't announced anything so far. Ansar Khan joining us from M Live. He is the Detroit Pistons and Red Wings beat writer for them. We thank you for being with us today. We have to move along. We only have a couple more minutes left in the show, but thank you very much for joining us on the Megacast. We enjoyed having you.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
A good day to you. Ansar Khan from the M Live Media Group. He writes about the Detroit Pistons and the Detroit Red Wings, and we were pleased to speak with him today on the Oakland County Megacast on our family of TV and radio stations. A lot of issues in sports and a lot of issues still left to be determined for municipalities. We just got a few more minutes left in the show. We'll wait just briefly while we get her connected. We're going to be speaking shortly with Debbie Binder, and again, thanking her so much for having us on the West Bloomfield Township Clerk's Office's Facebook page. I'm sure all the sports fans in West Bloomfield have been tuning in on the Clerk's Facebook page today to get all that information about Detroit Tigers baseball, Detroit Pistons basketball, and Detroit Red Wings hockey. But we need to get the information about the U.S. Census, and of course the best person for us to go to get that information is the West Bloomfield Township Clerk, Debbie Binder, who joins us now on the Oakland County Megacast. Debbie, thank you for being with us.
My pleasure, Tyler, as usual. Good to see you and good to see Erica. Thanks.
Yeah, always good to have you with us. Last time you were on, you had mentioned that the U.S. Census response numbers in West Bloomfield were still, and even in other local municipalities that you've spoken to, we're still pretty underwhelming. Has there been an improvement in that area as of late?
There's some good news, and then are we going as quickly as I would like to see us go? Again, my goal will be 100% participation, whether or not that's realistic. I know that hasn't been. The good news is we're at 76.4% self-response rate when we have now till October 31st to complete. And last year in 2010, our overall was 77.3. So we're less than 1 percentage point away from our last census turnout. Although in my mind, I'd like to get way beyond that 77.3. Even last time I would shoot for 100%, but let's be realistic. I'll be happy if we come in at 80, 85. So every person is, $18,000 over that 10-year period, $1,800 per year. If there was federal funding that was involved for an emergency like we're experiencing now, it's based on that population and our representation for the state. So it's important to have a complete and accurate count. And the only way to do that is to make sure that we have everybody participate and be counted. One of the areas that they always say is undercounted, which I just can't imagine, are babies, because babies are just so cute. You hate to miss counting a baby, but we just want to remind people that make sure you count the babies that are living in your home too. So.
Well, that's good to hear. And there's still tons of time left to fill it out too. You have until October to get your census information filled out. So there's a great.
There's 3 ways for people to respond. They can respond by either by the form that they can also contact.
All right, we seem to have
online. It takes.
Debbie, we're having just some connection issues with you. Just a moment. I'm going to let this buffer for just a quick moment, and hopefully we'll have you back to ask a couple more quick questions before we wrap up the hour. But Debbie Binder's saying that West Bloomfield really close to matching its 2010 census response numbers, about 1% away from that. So that's really good to hear. We do not quite have Debbie back. Debbie, are you still there? Can you at least hear us and respond? Let's see if we can hear you.
See if that's better.
It's a little bit better. We can at least hear you right now, so
okay.
That's fine.
It jumped Wi-Fi. I think that was actually on my end. I apologize. It jumped onto the generic Wi-Fi.
That's okay. So we just have a couple more minutes left. You also wanted to touch briefly on West Bloomfield Township's absentee voting. If you could touch on that real quick.
Yes, I want to make sure, we have an election coming up on August 4th and one on November 3rd. The absentee ballot applications are available starting now for the August 4th primary. If you're on the permanent absent voter list, your application did go out this week. You should get it any day. Reminder, you won't get a ballot unless you return that application completed and signed. So please make sure you do. I know you want to earn that sticker for I voted.
yeah.
It's really important to get out there and have your voice heard. If you have any questions, call the clerk's office at 248-451-4848 or email. It's easy to find between the website. You can find information, and also going back to the census website, I know we dropped, has a lot of important information if you wanted to find out how to respond. But as far as voting, go to the Township website, follow the clerk's office Facebook page. We try to make the information as accessible and easy to get as possible to make sure that everyone has access to the ballot. It's really important to get out there and be heard. And if you want to add your name to that permanent absent voter list, you will get an absent voter application to fill out automatically every election. You send that back, we receive it completed and signed, we send a ballot.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Debbie Binder. I got to let you go real quick.
Yeah,
We're coming up on the top of the hour, but thank you for being with us, and thank you for having us on your Facebook page today.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for helping spread the word. I greatly appreciate it.
Always a pleasure. Debbie Binder with us on the Oakland County Megacast. Just about 30 seconds left in the program today, and we thank all of our guests who have been on the show with us today. Dr. James Schwarz from Avondale Schools, Chief Jeffrey Baker from the Auburn Hills Police Department, and Dan Dickerson, play-by-play announcer for the Detroit Tigers Radio Network, as well as James R. Cool from the Tipping Point Theater, and Ansar Khan. For producer Jeff, Sim producer Larry, executive producer Dave Scott, my co-host Erica Jones, and I, we thank you for tuning in. Have a great weekend.